On the evening of September 14, 2005, Frances Elaine Newton lay strapped to a gurney inside Texas's Huntsville unit. At exactly 6:17 p.m., the state of Texas carried out her execution by lethal injection. She was 40 years old, making her the first black woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. Her alleged crimes had torn apart a Houston family on April 7, 1987. 3 lives lost in their apartment. Her husband Adrian, 23, shot in the head. Her 7-year-old son Alton, shot in the chest. Her baby daughter Farah, just 21 months old, also shot in the chest. All killed with a .25 caliber pistol that Frances admitted to removing from the scene. At first, the case seemed straightforward. A struggling mother, drowning in debt, who had purchased $100,000 in life insurance just 3 weeks before the murders. The motive appeared clear. Kill the family, collect the money. But as years passed, the conviction began to unravel. This wasn't just about insurance fraud. This was about a broken justice system, contaminated evidence, and an attorney so incompetent they called him Death Row Mock. The Houston Police Crime Lab would be exposed as corrupt. Crucial evidence would disappear. Even the victim's own parents would beg for Frances's life to be spared. What came later, 17 years of appeals, international protests, and questions that remain unanswered, would expose cracks in America's death penalty system. Her final moments, her refusal to speak last words, her rejection of a final meal, these weren't just routine procedures. They were the final acts of a woman whose silence spoke volumes. You'll hear about them later in this crime case, and when you do, they'll reveal everything about who Frances Newton really was. But to understand how an innocent woman may have been executed and how a calculating killer fooled the world, we have to go back. Back to a marriage falling apart, back to drug debts and desperation, back to the very beginning of Frances Newton. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences, and the darkest corners of human decision. Frances Elaine McLemore was born on April 12, 1965, in Houston, Texas. She grew up in a working-class African-American family in the city's 5th Ward, a neighborhood known for its tight-knit community but also economic challenges. Her parents, B. Henry Nelms and Jewel Nelms, worked hard to provide for their children. B. Henry worked in maintenance while Jewel held various service jobs. The family emphasized education and staying out of trouble in a neighborhood where opportunities were limited. Frances was described by family members as a responsible child who helped care for younger siblings. She attended local public schools and was known for her quiet demeanor. Teachers remembered her as a student who tried hard but struggled academically. As a teenager, Frances faced the typical challenges of growing up in an economically disadvantaged area. Limited job prospects and few recreational activities meant many young people in her neighborhood had to make difficult choices about their futures. In 1982, at age 17, Frances met Adrian Newton at a local social gathering. Adrian was 18 and worked various jobs around Houston. Adrian Jared Newton was born on May 15, 1963, in Houston's 3rd Ward. His parents, Tom and Virginia Lewis, raised him in a stable, working-class home where education and hard work were emphasized. His brother Sterling was his closest companion throughout childhood. Adrian showed promise as a student in his early years. Teachers noted his intelligence and ability to grasp complex concepts quickly. He enjoyed sports and was particularly good at basketball, playing on school teams through junior high. However, Adrian's academic performance declined during high school. He began skipping classes and spending time with friends who used drugs. By his senior year, he was struggling to graduate and had developed a regular marijuana habit. Despite these challenges, Adrian was known for his charisma and sense of humor. Friends described him as someone who could make anyone laugh and had a natural ability to connect with people. He was popular among his peers, but often made poor decisions. After high school, Adrian worked a series of entry-level jobs around Houston. He loaded trucks at warehouses, worked construction sites, and did maintenance work for local businesses. None of these positions lasted long, as Adrian had difficulty with authority figures and consistent schedules. Adrian and Frances' relationship developed quickly, and they began spending most of their time together. Frances became pregnant at 19, and she and Adrian decided to marry. Their first child, Alton, was born in 1980. The young couple moved into a small apartment and tried to build a stable life together. For several months, Adrian seemed committed to changing his lifestyle and taking on adult responsibilities. However, the pressures of supporting a family at such a young age proved overwhelming. Money was always tight for the Newton family. Frances worked as a customer service representative for an insurance company, while Adrian took jobs in construction and warehouse work. Their combined income was barely enough to cover rent, utilities, and basic necessities. Every month brought stress about which bills to pay first. Adrian began using drugs more frequently as a way to cope with financial stress. His drug use escalated from occasional marijuana smoking to regular cocaine use during the mid-1980s. What started as recreational use became a habit that affected his work performance and family relationships. He often disappeared for hours at a time without explanation, and money that should have gone toward groceries or children's clothing instead went to drug purchases. In December 1985, Frances was convicted of forgery and sentenced to 3 years of probation. Court records show she had forged a check, and a former employer testified that they had fired Frances for stealing money. By late 1985, their second child, Farah, was born, adding even more financial pressure to an already strained household. By 1986, Adrian owed money to several drug dealers around Houston. The amounts were not enormous by drug trade standards, but they represented significant sums for someone earning minimum wage. One dealer, known only as Charlie to Frances and Adrian's friends, became particularly persistent about collecting debts. Adrian owed Charlie approximately $1,500 by early 1987, creating constant anxiety as he knew drug dealers in Houston could be violent when not paid. The stress of poverty and Adrian's addiction destroyed their marriage. Frances confronted Adrian repeatedly about his drug use, but he either denied it or promised to stop. Both began seeking emotional support outside their marriage. Frances reconnected with Jeffrey Frello, a man she had known since junior high school who worked steady hours and seemed more mature than Adrian. Adrian started dating Ramona Bell, a woman who provided him escape from his home life stress and drug debts. Adrian's brother Sterling moved into the apartment around this time to help with expenses and provide emotional support. Sterling was concerned about the couple's relationship and Adrian's drug use but felt powerless to help. On March 18, 1987, Frances Newton made a decision. She purchased $50,000 life insurance policies for her husband Adrian and her 21-month-old daughter Farah through her employer's group insurance program. The timing was significant. The murders would occur exactly 3 weeks after Frances signed the insurance paperwork. Working as a customer service representative for an insurance company gave her direct access to information about life insurance policies and their benefits. The policies cost approximately $60 per month in premiums, a substantial expense for a family already struggling to pay basic bills. Frances's monthly take-home pay was around $800, making the insurance payments nearly 8% of her income. Frances already had a $50,000 life insurance policy on her 7-year-old son, Alton, through her workplace benefits. Adding policies for Adrian and Farah meant the family would have $150,000 in total life insurance coverage. To complete Adrian's application, Frances forged his signature. She later explained this action by saying she wanted to secure the coverage without Adrian knowing about the premium expense, as he might have objected to spending money they didn't have. Frances named herself as the beneficiary on both Adrian's and Farah's policies. This meant she would receive $100,000 if both her husband and daughter died, in addition to any existing coverage on her son Alton. By April 1987, both Frances and Adrian were spending significant time with their respective partners outside the marriage. They communicated primarily about practical matters related to their children and household responsibilities. Friends and family members who knew the couple described their relationship as emotionally over, even though they continued to live together. Both seemed to be waiting for a practical opportunity to separate permanently. The stress of their failing marriage created a toxic environment that inevitably affected both parents' relationships with their children. 7-year-old Alton, old enough to understand that something was fundamentally wrong in his home, became increasingly withdrawn and anxious. He witnessed the constant arguments between his parents about money and Adrian's disappearances. The boy often asked Francis why his father wasn't home and why there was so much shouting. Neighbors noticed that Alton had become quieter, more hesitant to play with other children in the apartment complex. Teachers at his school observed that he seemed tired and distracted, sometimes falling asleep in class or appearing worried about things beyond his years. 21-month-old Farah was too young to fully comprehend the tension, but even toddlers absorb the emotional atmosphere around them. Francis noticed that Farah had become more clingy, crying when left with babysitters and seeming to sense when her parents were upset with each other. The constant stress in the household was creating an unstable environment for both children, something that weighed heavily on Frances' mind as she tried to protect them from the worst of the marital conflict. Neither Francis nor Adrian had developed specific plans for divorce or separation, despite their relationship being emotionally over. The harsh reality was financial. Both lacked the resources to maintain separate households and seemed trapped in a situation neither wanted to continue. Divorce proceedings would cost money they didn't have. Setting up separate apartments would require security deposits, moving expenses, and duplicate household items they couldn't afford. Frances' income alone wouldn't cover rent, utilities, and childcare costs. Adrian's sporadic work and drug expenses meant he had no savings to establish his own place. They were caught in the cruel trap that affects many low-income families, staying together not out of love or compatibility, but because poverty made separation impossible. Every month, they pooled their resources just to meet basic obligations. Splitting up would mean both adults and their children would likely face homelessness, or have to move in with relatives who were also struggling financially. The psychological toll of this trapped feeling was enormous. Both Frances and Adrian felt like prisoners in their own relationship, going through the motions of family life while knowing their marriage was dead. They slept in the same bed, but lived separate emotional lives. They shared parenting duties, but communicated mainly about practical necessities. Who would pick up Alton from school, whether they had money for groceries or when bills were due. This toxic combination of financial desperation, drug addiction, infidelity, and parental responsibility created a powder keg of emotions that would explode on April 7, 1987. April 7, 1987, began as what appeared to be a typical Tuesday for the Newton family, though underneath the routine lay all the tensions that had been building for months. Frances woke early to prepare for her customer service job, going through the familiar motions of getting ready for work while Adrian remained in bed. The apartment was cramped, and morning routines required careful coordination to avoid conflict. Frances left for work at her insurance company office, where she handled customer calls and paperwork. She participated in normal office conversations, handled her regular workload, and seemed as stressed about money as always, but not unusually agitated or distracted. Some coworkers remembered her seeming tired, which they attributed to her ongoing marital problems that were well known around the office. While Frances was at work, Adrian stayed home with baby Farah. This arrangement was typical when Adrian wasn't working construction or warehouse jobs. 7-year-old Alton was at his elementary school, following his normal daily routine. Adrian's brother Sterling, who had been living with the family to help with expenses, was also out for most of the day, either working or handling personal business. Adrian spent most of the morning and early afternoon at the apartment with Farah. Neighbors in the complex later recalled seeing him outside briefly in the afternoon, describing his behavior as completely normal. He seemed to be in a relatively good mood and was observed playing with his daughter in the apartment courtyard. There was nothing about his demeanor that suggested he felt threatened or feared for his safety. To outside observers, he appeared to be a young father enjoying time with his toddler daughter on a pleasant spring day. During her lunch break at work, Frances made arrangements that would later become significant to the case timeline. She contacted her uncle, who agreed to watch little Farah later that day while Frances ran errands after work. This decision seemed routine. Working mothers often needed help with childcare to handle personal business. The afternoon progressed normally until Sterling Newton, Adrian's brother, returned to the apartment around 5:30 or 6 p.m. When he arrived, he found Frances already there with Adrian and Farah. Frances had apparently come home from work at her normal time and was going through her usual after-work routine. However, Sterling immediately sensed that the atmosphere in the apartment was tense, which he attributed to the couple's ongoing marital problems. He had witnessed many arguments between Frances and Adrian over recent months, so domestic tension had become the norm rather than the exception. What happened next would become crucial to the prosecution's timeline. Frances asked Sterling to leave the apartment so she could talk with Adrian privately about their relationship. Sterling later testified that this request didn't seem unusual, as the couple often needed privacy to discuss their problems. He agreed to leave, planning to return later in the evening after giving them time to work through whatever issues they needed to address. Sterling left the apartment between 6:30 and 7 p.m., not knowing it would be the last time he would see his brother alive. At approximately 6:45 p.m., while Frances was still in the apartment, Adrian received a phone call from his girlfriend, Ramona Bell. This phone call would later become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case. Adrian and Ramona talked for approximately 15 minutes, during which Adrian told her several important things. He said he was tired and planned to go to sleep soon, but crucially, he added that he wouldn't rest until Frances left the apartment because he didn't trust her. At approximately 7 p.m., Frances arrived at her cousin Sandra Nelms's house on Seeley Street. Sandra lived next door to an abandoned house that belonged to Frances's parents. Frances had driven to Sandra's house in her own car, traveling from the apartment on West Mount Houston Road to the Seeley Street location. Before going inside Sandra's house to visit her cousin, Frances took a blue bag from her car and placed it inside the abandoned house next door. Sandra witnessed this action directly, watching as Frances carried the bag into the empty building that Frances's family sometimes used for storage. At the time, Sandra didn't think this was unusual behavior. Families often stored items in available spaces, especially when living in cramped apartments. After placing the bag in the abandoned house, Frances went to Sandra's front door and asked her cousin to come with her to check on Adrian and the children at the apartment. Frances seemed concerned and told Sandra she wanted someone with her when she went home. Frances and Sandra left Sandra's house and drove to the apartment complex on West Mount Houston Road, arriving around 8 p.m. Frances found Adrian's body on the living room couch where he had been watching television. He had been shot once in the head with a .25 caliber pistol. Blood had pooled on the couch and floor around his body, and it was immediately clear that he was dead. The positioning of his body suggested he had been resting or sleeping when attacked. The women then discovered the children's bodies in the bedroom. 7-year-old Alton and 21-month-old Farah had each been shot once in the chest with the same .25 caliber pistol. They were lying in their beds, covered with blankets, as if they had been sleeping when attacked. The killer had apparently entered the bedroom quietly and shot both children at close range while they slept. The scene was devastating. 2 small children who should have been safe in their own beds had been murdered in what appeared to be execution-style killings. There were no signs that either child had struggled with their attacker or had even awakened before being shot. The cold-blooded nature of killing sleeping children would become a central element in the prosecution's argument for the death penalty. Frances became completely hysterical upon discovering the children's bodies, according to Sandra. She screamed uncontrollably and was so distraught that she had difficulty providing basic information when Sandra tried to call for help. Sandra had to search through papers in the apartment to find the address to give to emergency dispatchers, as Frances was too traumatized to provide coherent information. At 8:27 p.m., Deputy R.W. Ricks of the Harris County Sheriff's Office was dispatched to the apartment complex on a report of possible shooting. He arrived to find Frances and Sandra outside the apartment, both visibly distraught. Frances was crying and seemed to be in shock. The apartment was a typical two-bedroom unit in a working-class complex. Deputy Ricks entered cautiously, unsure if the perpetrator might still be inside. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting the killer either had a key or was known to the victims. Adrian Newton's body lay on a brown couch in the small living room. He had been shot once in the right side of his head with what appeared to be a small-caliber weapon. Blood had pooled on the couch cushions and dripped onto the carpet below. The living room showed no signs of a struggle. Furniture was in normal positions, and personal items remained undisturbed on tables and shelves. Nothing appeared to be missing, ruling out robbery as a motive for the attack. Deputy Ricks proceeded to the bedroom where he discovered the bodies of 7-year-old Alton and 21-month-old Farah Newton. Both children had been shot once in the chest and were lying in their beds, covered with blankets. Crime scene investigators arrived shortly after Deputy Ricks completed his initial survey. They photographed the scene extensively and began collecting physical evidence. The apartment's small size made their work relatively straightforward. Ballistics experts determined that all 3 victims had been killed with the same .25 caliber weapon. The bullets had caused massive internal damage, ensuring quick death for all victims. The killer had aimed for vital areas and fired from close range. Investigators found no fingerprints on surfaces that would help identify the perpetrator. The killer had apparently been careful not to touch items unnecessarily or had worn gloves during the attack. This suggested some level of planning or criminal experience. The lack of blood on walls or furniture indicated that the victims had not moved significantly after being shot. This supported the theory that the children were asleep, and Adrian was resting on the couch when the attack occurred. Frances told investigators that she had arrived at the apartment around 8 p.m. with her cousin to check on her family. She explained that she and Adrian were having marital problems but were still living together for financial reasons. Most importantly, Frances immediately disclosed that she had removed a gun from the apartment earlier that evening. She said she had taken the weapon to her parents' abandoned house on Seeley Street because she was concerned about having a gun around her children. Detectives were initially puzzled by Frances's admission about removing the gun. Most people would not voluntarily tell police about possessing a potential murder weapon unless they were confident it would not incriminate them. Homicide Detective Michael Talton accompanied Frances and Sandra to the abandoned house on Seeley Street around 10 p.m. Sandra led them to the specific location where Frances had placed the blue bag containing the gun. Inside the bag, Detective Talton found a blue steel Raven Arms .25 caliber automatic pistol. The weapon appeared to be in good working condition and had recently been fired, based on the smell of gunpowder residue. The gun was immediately sent for ballistics testing to determine if it was the murder weapon. The quick recovery of the weapon was unusual in homicide cases, as killers typically dispose of firearms in locations where they cannot be easily found. Frances's cousin Sandra confirmed that she had witnessed Frances placing the blue bag in the abandoned house before they went to the apartment. This testimony established a clear timeline and corroborated Frances's account of her actions. Investigators were struck by several unusual aspects of the crime scene. The lack of forced entry suggested the killer was known to the victims or had access to the apartment. The execution-style murders indicated planning rather than spontaneous violence. The fact that Frances had a key to the apartment and had been at the scene earlier in the day made her an immediate person of interest. Her troubled marriage and recent purchase of life insurance policies provided potential motives for the killings. However, investigators also noted that Frances had voluntarily provided information about the gun and had brought a witness with her when discovering the bodies. These actions seemed inconsistent with someone trying to cover up involvement in the murders. The crime scene analysis would become crucial to the prosecution's case. The lack of physical evidence linking Frances to the actual shooting meant that circumstantial evidence would determine whether she could be convicted of the murders. Within hours of discovering the bodies, investigators were developing theories about what had happened in the Newton apartment that evening. Frances's behavior and statements would be scrutinized intensively as the investigation proceeded. Investigators calculated that Frances would have had approximately 20 minutes to commit the murders, clean herself up, and drive to Sandra's house. This timeline seemed tight but possible, according to the prosecution. The motive for the murders appeared clear to investigators. Frances was struggling financially, had recently purchased substantial life insurance policies, and was involved in a failing marriage with a drug-addicted husband who owed money to dangerous people. Frances consistently maintained her innocence and offered an alternative theory of the crime. She told investigators that Adrian owed approximately $100 to a drug dealer known as Charlie, who had been making threats about collecting the debt. However, investigators never seriously pursued the drug dealer angle. They did not attempt to identify Charlie or investigate Adrian's drug debts, focusing instead on building the case against Frances based on the physical evidence. Frances's previous conviction for forgery in 1985 was seen as evidence of her willingness to commit crimes for financial gain. Prosecutors argued this established a pattern of illegal behavior that culminated in murder for insurance money. The insurance policies remained the cornerstone of the prosecution's motive theory. The fact that Frances had forged Adrian's signature and purchased the policies just 3 weeks before the murders seemed to demonstrate premeditation. Investigators also discovered that Frances had asked co-workers detailed questions about insurance claims procedures and payout timelines. These inquiries suggested she was planning to file claims soon after purchasing the policies. 2 weeks after the murders, Frances filed claims for the life insurance benefits, seeking to collect $100,000 for Adrian's and Farah's deaths. This action provided investigators with additional evidence of financial motive for the killings. On April 22, 1987, exactly 2 weeks after the murders, Frances Newton was arrested and charged with capital murder. The Harris County District Attorney's Office announced they would seek the death penalty, citing the heinous nature of killing 2 children. The arrest marked the beginning of a legal process that would span nearly 2 decades and raise serious questions about the quality of justice in capital cases. When Frances Newton was arrested for capital murder, she could not afford to hire a private attorney. The court appointed Ron Mock to represent her, a decision that would prove catastrophic for her defense and ultimately contribute to her execution. Ron Mock was already notorious in Texas legal circles by 1987. Known as Death Row Mock, he had represented 19 capital murder defendants and had never achieved an acquittal. 16 of his clients received death sentences, an extraordinary failure rate even by Texas standards. Mock's reputation was so poor that experienced prosecutors actually preferred to face him rather than competent defense attorneys. His predictable strategies and minimal preparation made it easier for the state to secure convictions and death sentences. The Texas criminal justice system at the time operated under a philosophy that any attorney with a pulse and a law license was qualified to defend capital cases. Mock epitomized this approach, taking numerous death penalty cases for the fee payments without regard for his ability to provide effective representation. Mock's approach to capital defense was characterized by minimal investigation, few motions, and reluctance to call witnesses. He often relied on his clients' testimony alone, believing that personal appeals to juries were more effective than thorough legal preparation. When Francis Newton's case began, Mock immediately demonstrated his inadequate approach. In a court hearing shortly before trial, he admitted to the judge that he had not filed any motions, spoken with any witnesses, or submitted a list of potential witnesses to subpoena. Frances and her family quickly recognized that Mock was not providing effective representation. They begged the trial judge to allow Frances to change attorneys, pointing out Mock's obvious lack of preparation and his terrible track record in capital cases. Judge Charlie Hearn granted Frances's motion to substitute counsel, but refused to grant a continuance for the new attorney to prepare. This left Frances with an impossible choice: proceed to trial with Mock or face trial with a new attorney who had no time to prepare. Frances chose to keep Mock rather than force a replacement attorney to handle her case without adequate preparation time. This decision would haunt her for the rest of her life, as Mock's incompetence became apparent throughout the trial. On the day Frances's trial began, Mock admitted to the court that he could not name a single witness he had interviewed on her behalf. This confession shocked observers and demonstrated his complete failure to investigate potential defenses. Mock had not contacted Adrian's parents, Tom and Virginia Lewis, who later stated they would have testified on Frances' behalf. He failed to investigate the drug dealer theory or pursue alternative suspects who might have killed the Newton family. The attorney also did not hire forensic experts to challenge the state's scientific evidence or ballistics testimony. Mock simply accepted the prosecution's version of events without conducting independent testing or analysis. Mock's co-counsel, Catherine Coulter, later signed an affidavit agreeing that she and Mock had provided ineffective legal assistance. She confirmed that Mock had told her he had thoroughly investigated the evidence when he actually had not. During the trial, Mock's strategy consisted primarily of putting Frances on the witness stand to deny the charges. He presented no alternative theories, called no character witnesses, and offered no expert testimony to counter the state's case. His poor performance was so obvious that even the prosecution felt uncomfortable, but they proceeded knowing Mock's incompetence would virtually guarantee a conviction and death sentence. On November 17, 1987, after deliberating for several hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges. Frances Newton was convicted with killing her husband Adrian Newton and son Alton Newton, in addition to her daughter Farah, making her eligible for the death penalty. The punishment phase of the trial proceeded immediately. The prosecution argued that Frances posed a continuing threat to society and that the murders were so heinous that death was the only appropriate punishment. On October 25, 1988, the jury sentenced Frances Newton to death by lethal injection. She became one of the few women on Texas's death row and would spend the next 17 years fighting to prove her innocence. Frances Newton was transferred to the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, in November 1988 to begin her life on death row. At 23 years old, she was one of the youngest women ever sentenced to death in Texas and would spend the next 17 years fighting for her life. Death row conditions were harsh by design. Frances's cell contained only a metal bed, toilet, sink, and small table. She was allowed few personal possessions and had no access to television or radio for most of her incarceration. The appeal process moved slowly through state and federal courts. Frances's initial appeals were handled by inexperienced attorneys who lacked the resources to conduct thorough investigations or challenge the original conviction effectively. Frances's family visited regularly when possible, though the distance to Gatesville made frequent visits difficult. Her mother, Jewel Nelms, became her strongest advocate, organizing letter-writing campaigns and seeking media attention for the case. Adrian's parents, Tom and Virginia Louie, maintained contact with Frances during her incarceration. They expressed doubts about her guilt and eventually wrote letters opposing her execution, despite believing she had killed their son. By 2004, Frances Newton had been on death row for 16 years, and her execution date was finally set. The announcement triggered an intensive legal and public relations campaign to save her life, as new evidence continued to emerge about problems with her conviction. As September 2005 approached, Frances Newton's legal team filed final appeals with every available court, hoping to prevent what they believed would be the execution of an innocent woman. The appeals focused on new evidence and constitutional violations in her original trial. The U.S. Supreme Court received 2 separate petitions challenging Frances' conviction and death sentence. Her attorneys argued that executing someone with so many unresolved questions about guilt would violate the Constitution's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. On September 9, 2005, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied Frances's 4th application for writ of habeas corpus. The court ruled that the issues being raised had been previously considered and rejected, closing off her state court options. The 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals also refused to grant a stay of execution on September 12, 2005. The federal courts ruled that Frances had not met the strict standards required for last-minute intervention in death penalty cases. On September 13, 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court declined without dissent to hear both of Frances' final appeals. The court's refusal to intervene removed the last legal obstacle to her execution and sealed her fate. Governor Perry rejected Frances's final clemency petition at 5:50 p.m. on September 14, 2005, just hours before her scheduled execution. Perry stated that he had reviewed the case thoroughly and found no compelling reason to grant clemency. Protesters gathered outside the Huntsville unit, where Frances was scheduled to be executed. Approximately 100 death penalty opponents held a prayer vigil and demonstrated against what they considered a grave injustice. Frances spent her final day meeting with family members and spiritual advisors. She maintained her innocence until the end and expressed hope that someday the truth about her case would be revealed. Frances's mother, Jewel Nelms, was too ill to attend the execution due to stress-related health problems. Her father and other family members were present to witness her final moments. Adrian's cousins attended to represent the victims, but his parents, Tom and Virginia Lewis, chose not to witness the execution due to their opposition to capital punishment. Frances was transported from the Mountain View unit to the Huntsville death chamber on September 13, 2005. On September 14 at 6:09 p.m., she was strapped to the gurney and declined to make a final statement, quietly saying no when asked. She briefly looked toward her family and appeared to mouth something to them as the lethal drugs began flowing. Frances coughed once and gasped as her eyes closed. She was pronounced dead at 6:17 p.m., exactly 8 minutes later. After 17 years, 10 months, and 20 days on death row, Frances Newton became the first black woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. Family members left the prison immediately after the execution. Adrian's cousins expressed disappointment that Frances had not apologized, while Frances's family maintained her innocence even after her death. The execution concluded one of the most controversial death penalty cases in Texas history, with questions about her guilt and legal representation continuing long after her death. If this case has raised questions for you about justice, reasonable doubt, and the death penalty system, you're not alone. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more in-depth true crime documentaries. Your subscription helps us continue investigating these complex cases and bringing you the detailed analysis you deserve.